Right, welcome back, Year 8. Those who know me, my name is obviously Mr. Hughes, and I'll be doing some presentations for you over the next half term on a particular scheme of work, which I'll introduce at the moment, and the worksheets to complement that scheme of work, complement the presentations that I'll be doing, will be put on the system by Miss Mustafa and Miss Panu. Okay. Should you have any questions, I'm sure you will have loads of questions about the stuff that we'll be doing this half term, you need to contact obviously your class teacher, your English teacher this academic year. Okay, so what's the scheme of work? What's the work of the unit that we'll be looking at? It's a continuation of something you did last year. In Year 7, you did Shakespeare. And in Year 7 Shakespeare, you looked very much at Shakespeare in context, when he was writing, where he was writing, aspects of his life, aspects of actually what Shakespearean and early Jacobean theatre would have been like, Elizabethan theatre and so on, what it would have been like, what a visit to the theatre might have been and so on. This year in Year 8 we're aiming to take it a little step further. And what we're looking to do this year is very much actually start looking at texts, okay, so start looking at some of the plays and the characters from those plays. And equally we're going to be asking you to analyse some of the language and make some evaluations on judgments as well. Now, what we've entitled this scheme of work is Shakespeare's Greatest Heroes and Villains. And what I'll be doing presentations on is 3 heroes, okay, and 3 villains. At the end of it, in sort of 4 or 5 weeks' time, we're going to be asking you, from all the work that you've done, to make a judgment. Who do you think is the most heroic, and why? And who do you think is the most villainous, and why? And the why part of it might be aspects of context about things that they did, okay? Or it might be things based on the language. But it's about really engaging with it, okay? And that engagement is quite difficult. And a lot of people think that Shakespeare, the language of Shakespeare, is, albeit it's 400 years old, is absolutely inaccessible. Well, it's difficult sometimes. But what you need to understand is the more familiar you are with it, the more that you practice reading it, the more that you practice seeing it, understanding and seeing plays and performance and things like that, it actually becomes not just accessible, but actually very, very enjoyable. Okay, so we'll be doing some work on that. There will be many, many questions, as I said. That being the case, simply contact your English teacher and they'll be able to answer some. Okay, I'm sure. Okay, so we're looking at heroes and villains. And the first thing that I want you to be thinking about, and of course you can pause this presentation as you go along, is what do we mean by heroism? And what do we mean by villainy? Okay. Now, in the context of what's happening at the moment, I think a lot of us may reevaluate what we think heroes really are and what the traits of a hero really are. An element of it, I'm sure, is that idea. Just bear with while the pips go. I'm sure you'll agree that one of the elements of heroism is that idea of sacrifice. Okay, of willing to do something for the greater good. Equally, there might be an element when it comes to heroism of having an objective, having something that you want in mind and really going for it. Okay, is an aspect of heroism being up against adversity, having a real challenge, something which is difficult to get over and striving to achieve that. Is that part of heroism? But I'm sure that one of the worksheets that Miss Panu and Miss Mustafa will be putting on the system is asking you to think about what is meant by heroism. And like I said, that is a definition which is changing maybe a bit of its meaning at the moment. You know, if you're like me, you like things like Marvel films and DC films and things like that, we have ideas of what we think heroism might be based on those. Okay? Similarly, maybe we attach the word hero a little bit too liberally sometimes. Maybe we think that certain people are our heroes when they don't really deserve to be. And maybe those people who go a bit unseen in society should be a bit more deserving of that label of hero. Okay, so this is very much an idea of you thinking about things at the moment. Okay, just getting that brain working again. The same could be said for villainy. If someone is a villain, what does it actually mean? Okay, does it mean simply that they are doing bad things? They're doing things which actually impact negatively on other people? is there a bit of design about villainy? If we think about these types of films again, and we've got our archetypal villains, our stereotypical villains, is it they simply want to do bad things because they want to achieve something particularly in mind? Okay, and obviously looking at the sort of ideas that we've got here, you might attach different ideas about what you think villainy is at the moment. Okay, one thing I would say, and this is very, very important to what we're looking at with regards to Shakespeare, is that sometimes we have an extreme idea of what a hero is, and we have an extreme idea of what a villain is. And that's very much perpetuated by what we see in the media, in films and things like that, and things which we are told. Okay? But sometimes there can be a bit of a grey area. Sometimes you can have a character, and Shakespeare does this a great deal, and I'll talk about that in a moment. Sometimes you can have a character who shows incredible heroic tendencies and actually has those traits, has those characteristics of being very heroic, being brave, willing to sacrifice things in pursuit of what they want to happen. But sometimes, if we pursue something, we're actually earnestly going to get what we want, then sometimes other aspects of our character can come into play, maybe even villainous aspects. So what Shakespeare looks at isn't the fact that someone is through and through heroic, isn't through and through villainous, but sometimes there's that mixture of the two. Now that brings me on to this idea. What is it that makes Shakespeare so enduring? And one of the most common questions as an English teacher or a head of English that I've ever been asked is, why do we still study Shakespeare in the classroom? I'm sure you know from the contextual work that you did last year in Year 7 that Shakespeare was writing over 400 years ago. So what is it that's relevant about some guy who was writing 4 centuries ago to you, Year 8 students, and going all the way through up to Year 11 and beyond? Why is it we still teach Shakespeare so much? And what is so enduring about his work? What is the quality of Shakespeare's work that makes it still the most taught writer, playwright, in the English classroom? And probably the most famous writer and playwright in the history of literature. Okay? Now I'm asking you some big questions here, but don't disengage from them. Don't think I can't do this, because I'm assuring you, you can. Because the whole thing about studying literature is it's actually about what you think and what you feel. And that brings me on to why. And one of the main reasons I think that Shakespeare is so enduring, why he still lasts and why he is so relevant. Now, Shakespeare obviously wrote plays, and I'm sure you've heard many of them. You've probably sort of thought about, you've heard these words bandied about. You've heard about Macbeth, you know about Romeo and Juliet, Othello, Hamlet, and many, many others. Okay? But what Shakespeare wrote about was people. Okay? Whether it is a lord in 13th century Scotland, whether it's a man living in 16th century Venice, whether it's two young people living in 16th century Verona, or someone living in Denmark, the stories aren't so much the important thing. The thing that characterises the quality of Shakespeare is he wrote about people. And people do not change. And their emotions do not change. Macbeth, and we'll be looking at one of the characters in Macbeth when we come to look at our villains. Macbeth is a play about a man who wants to be king. And he is persuaded by his wife, and other factors as well, to actually murder his way to take that crown. So it's a play about ambition. Now, people are still ambitious now. People still want things now. And when I say this is about people, ambition and that aspect of our human nature has not changed over the centuries. Ambition in 13th century Scotland is the same as ambition in 21st century England. Othello is about a general in the army, and his best friend called Iago, who's a character we'll look at, a wonderful character, keeps on whispering in his ear that his wife called Desdemona is having an affair with somebody. And Othello is absolutely overcome by jealousy. Jealousy, just like ambition, has not changed over the centuries. Jealousy, back in 16th century Venice, is the same as jealousy in 21st century England. Hamlet. Lots of questions about what Hamlet is about. The character Hamlet is one of the few literary characters from a book, who essentially has been psychoanalyzed. Such is the depth of his character. And that's why in this picture you've got this maze in his mind. Okay? What is Hamlet about, essentially? Well, it's about a young man who is not quite ready to become king. And I would always argue that some people say the problem with Hamlet is he procrastinates. When you procrastinate, it means that you put off doing things. Well, maybe. But I always think that Hamlet is more about mental health. Somebody who's not ready yet to engage with the world as he should do. And, very, very topical nowadays, in the context that we're in, everyone's always worried about how people are coping, about mental health and our emotions. And mental health and a focus on it was not something which was particularly important when Shakespeare was writing. But 400 years ago, he started exploring it. And mental health in 16th century Denmark is pretty much the same as mental health in 21st century England. So this is about people again. And finally, a play that you might be a little bit more familiar with is Romeo and Juliet. Two young people who fall in love and are desperate to be with each other in the face of a great deal of adversity in their families. Now, love, just like ambition, just like jealousy, just like mental health and things like that, is the same in 16th century Verona as it is in 21st century England. Okay, it's bittersweet, as he puts it, that oxymoron. Love can be an amazing thing, sweet, but can also be very, very painful, bitter. Okay, so this is what I mean about why is Shakespeare so enduring? Why are we still studying him? It's because it's not so much about the text, it's about the people within the text. Okay. Now, the other thing that Shakespeare identified was he thought there were two types of people. He thought there were those people who are the thinkers, always thinking about what should be done, always thinking about meanings and purpose and things like that. And he thought there were the doers, the people who got up off their seat and went and did something and said, I'm not going to just talk about this, I'm actually going to achieve it. I'm going to do something to achieve my objectives. Okay? And there's lots that has been said about what type of people are his characters, and you might even think about, well, what type of person are you? Are you a thinker? Somebody who maybe puts things off because you want to overthink it a bit too much? Or are you the person who leaps in and says, no, I'm going to get this done. I'm going to achieve what I want to achieve. This view obviously is one, it's not the dreamers that are remembered, it's the doers, the people who actually step out and actually do it. And when we look at a couple of Shakespeare's characters, someone like Hamlet here, very famous image of this young man holding a skull. He's thinking about, what is the purpose of life? If all we are is this underneath our flesh and things like that, what is the purpose of what we do? Rather than engaging with simply enjoying life, he's always thinking about the whys. As Shakespeare puts it in that play, words, words, words. He's always putting things into words. But others of Shakespeare's characters, which we'll be looking at as well, are doers. Those people who have situation, circumstance forced upon them, sometimes take the initiative in it, but they go out and they do something about it. Okay? Now keep that in mind when we come to the first of the characters that we're going to be looking at. I'm just going to check that I'm still recording. Okie doke. Alright. So, we're going to start off by looking at a villain, okay, which tend to be the more fun parts to play in Shakespeare. And the three villains that we are going to look at are Richard III, okay, who is an actual king of England, okay, between 1485 and 1482 and 1485. He was at the beginning of his play called Richard Duke of Gloucester, and like Macbeth, he kills his way to the throne, and I'll talk to you about that in due course. The play itself is called King Richard III. Okay, and what is it that he did to make him such a villain, or perceived as such a villain? And I'll talk about that again, exactly why Shakespeare did it. He killed members of his own family to get to the throne. He killed his own brothers, and very, very infamously, he killed his two nephews, called Richard and Edward, who are imprisoned in the Tower of London, okay, which you might have heard of. So that's King Richard III. You can see throughout this as well, I'm going to put on some clips and stuff for you, so it's not just going to be me talking at you. Okay? Then we're going to look at Lady Macbeth. Okay? She was Queen of Scotland, not straight away, she was the wife of a lord in Scotland. The play itself is the tragedy of Macbeth, and you can see the word tragedy there is very important, characteristics of tragedy. And what is it that she did which made her so villainous? Well, the main thing is she persuaded her husband to kill the king so he could become king. Okay? And the last character that we're going to look at is called Iago, which is that man there. Okay, it's in the play Othello. And what is it that Iago very, very famously does? Well, you can see him whispering in his best friend Othello's ear, as I said, always telling him that his wife is up to no good, and she was completely innocent of that. So what Iago does is lie and lie and lie. Okay? When we've done those, it's up to you. Who is it that you think is going to be the most villainous? And we're going to start off with King Richard III. Okay? Now, the images here, you can pause on this, like I said, whenever you want. The images we have here will probably paint a picture for you of Richard as a villain. Okay? These are some of the posters that we might associate with King Richard III. And you can probably pick up certain things which you think might happen. So pause it on that particular image for a bit. Have a study of those posters. And just think about what characteristics and features might actually come into this play. Now, if you think about it, this is about a man who is after the throne. Okay? You can see the shape of him there, and that is very, very important. Okay? He's almost sort of glowering over the throne like that, over the crown. Then we've got him almost as this beetle scurrying around. Again, pursuit of that crown. You can see the three in this one, Richard III, is almost like claw marks, bloody. This one, not absolutely clear, but in this one we've got 3 guns. Now, remembering when this took place, Richard III was killed at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, Battle of Bosworth Field. So it wouldn't have been the case that they had guns, but very often in Shakespeare we have modern adaptations, where we have things that are actually modernised and put in a contemporary context. And then we've got some guns and those things. So it might be that part of this is about battle. Okay? King Richard III was one of the only 2 English kings to actually be killed in battle since 1066. And this one as well, we've got this idea, strangely, of the military idea of it again. There's a darkness to it, but there's a strange idea of deformity. Okay? Not obviously the horrific things that would happen on a battlefield in medieval times, with swords and axes and things like that. There's an element of deformity to this. Okay? So have a look at those, and just see if you can even pick up and analyse. And by analyse, it means think what things mean and your own interpretations of them. What actually the themes and ideas in this particular play might be. Okay? Like I said, Miss Panu and Miss Mustafa will be putting sheets online for you to use to complement what I'm talking about. But again, a lot of it, even if you're just making your own independent notes and sort of ideas about things as we go along. Okay. Again, when we actually look at the character here, you can get some ideas about exactly what I'm talking about how Richard III is represented. But a couple of these things might surprise you a bit. This is actually a very, very famous performance of the play that I went to go and see when I was probably about your age by an actor called Anthony Sher. Okay? And Richard has a hunchback. Okay? You might have seen in the news, this is going back a few years, but it'll definitely be online. You might have seen in the news that actually a king's skeleton was found underneath a car park in Leicestershire. Okay? And that was the skeleton of King Richard III. So after he was defeated in battle in 1485, his body was buried somewhere. Okay? And they found out where it is, and they found out whether Richard III actually had a hunchback, so a deformity. We're going to look at a bit of a clip in a moment when we start looking at some of the language from it, which actually really illustrates that. So he has this deformity, he has a hunchback, and he had a withered arm, strangely. Okay, so and you can see in this adaptation here, not only is he dressed in all black, but he's also got these crutches, and he moved around the stage in a very sort of spider-like way. And he's got these bits of material coming from him to really accentuate the idea that he's a spider. And of course, we associate this spider, probably unfairly, with scurrying around, doing things they probably shouldn't be doing, but also probably elements of evil as well. Okay? In this picture here, and this is again, you can interpret these, you can pause it and actually have a look, or just look yourself online, put in Richard III images, and see what images come up. This one is a really famous adaptation by an actor called Laurence Olivier. Okay? And he very much plays the audience all the time. We're going to be looking at, in 5 or 10 minutes' time, the opening soliloquy. Now, if you remember from last year, a soliloquy is when you have one character on stage talking to the audience. Richard III is the only one of Shakespeare's plays to start with a soliloquy. So on comes Richard III onto the stage and immediately addresses the audience. Now, the impact of that dramatically is that we are drawn into his world, into his thought processes. And bizarrely because of that, not only do we feel part of it, but we sort of find him attractive. We find his character attractive. And as I said, very often, not just in plays but in films as well, it's the villains who are the more attractive characters. Okay, and by attractive, I mean that we want to actually go along with their story a little bit more. And he's always looking to the audience. In this film adaptation, he's always looking to the camera. Just because he was deformed in this way, he's not meant to be particularly physically attractive. But there was something very charming about him. He was a doer, and we'll talk about that as well. If he wanted something, he grasped it. He took the initiative, and he took it. But he's also a man of words. He's very manipulative of people, using language. In this adaptation here, by a very famous actor, Ian McKellen, Richard III is almost likened to a Hitler character. Okay, so an odious, horrible historical character, but somebody who is able to manipulate a whole nation behind him. So that attractiveness again. In this one, you can see Richard III, played by Al Pacino of all people, okay, with an arrow in him. This is obviously at the Battle of Bosworth again. But he was brave. And Benedict Cumberbatch playing him here, he was a brave soldier. I'll talk about that in due course. And this is what I was talking about at the beginning. This is about a villain, a through and through villain. To an Elizabethan audience, and I'll say why contextually in a moment, to an Elizabethan audience, this character would only have been around about 60 years before Elizabeth comes to the throne. So it's about when Hitler was fighting the Second World War, and you cannot get a more villainous character in British history than Hitler. And this is the way an Elizabethan audience would have perceived Richard III for a number of reasons. But he's a villain. But he's also heroic in some ways. He is attractive. Okay, he's attractive because, not just because of his way with the women, not just because he is a doer and grasps initiatives, but because he is brave, and in pursuit of the thing that he wants, which is the crown, he is willing to do anything. And he admits at the end of the play, when he's visited by all the ghosts of the people that he's killed, I am I. I'm not going to hide it. This is what I am, and this is what I've said I would do from the very first lines of the play. I hope you've enjoyed it. That's the point he tries to make. Right. Now, this is a little bit about context. And by context, I mean some background information. All of this will be made available to you. I don't expect you to understand it all, but it just gives you a better understanding of the play. Just bear with me for a minute. Okay. So, first of all, just a little bit of background about the historical context. You might, if you've got some notes, you've got a piece of paper in front of you, you can make a couple of bullet points on here. Okay? So, historical context. The play is set at the end of the Wars of the Roses. Now, the Wars of the Roses, you might have heard of. They were a civil war in England that had lasted for almost 100, 150 odd years. But they were coming to the end at the end of the 15th century, in the 1480s. Okay? Why are they called the Wars of the Roses? Well, there were two families who were essentially fighting over the English throne. There was the Lancastrians, or the House of Lancaster, and they were represented by a red rose. Then you have the other family who they were fighting, were called the Yorkists, or the House of York, and they were represented by the white rose, hence the Wars of the Roses. Okay. Richard III, he was called the Duke of Gloucester at the beginning of the play. He isn't the king yet at the beginning of the play. Okay? And Richard is from the House of York. Okay? You'll see there's a third rose here, okay, which is very, very relevant. And that is called the Tudor rose. Okay? Now Richard was from not just the York family, but the series of kings, the dynasty, okay, for a century or so we call the Plantagenets. At the end of the Plantagenets, the next big family which takes the English throne are called the Tudors. And that happens in 1485. Why? Because at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where Richard is killed, he is killed by a man called Richmond, who is also known as Henry Tudor, the first of the Tudor monarchs, and he's called Henry VII. What he does is said, look, we need to put an end to this civil war. We've got to join up these families. How does he join up the families? Well, the red rose plus the white rose equals the Tudor rose, or it's a bit of both. If you go to places like Hampton Court, you go to places like Hever Castle, historical places like that, you will see that Tudor rose everywhere. It's about bringing together these warring families. Okay? So, Richard is Duke of Gloucester at the beginning of the play in about 1483. Okay? Richard has two brothers. Okay? One of them is on the throne. He's the king at the time. Okay? And he is called Edward the Fourth. Okay? Edward the Fourth. And there's another brother there, another older brother, called George, Duke of Clarence. Okay? So that's two people between Richard and the throne. Edward also has two sons, and they're children. Okay? And they are called Edward and Richard, just to confuse things. So if Richard wants to get the throne of England, he's got to get rid of his oldest brother, Edward IV. He's got to get rid of his second oldest brother, George, Duke of Clarence, and he's got to get rid of the next people in line to the throne, Edward IV's two sons, called Edward and Richard. So there are four people between Richard and the throne, the thing that he wants to do. Okay? Now, the other thing that I've mentioned is that Richard apparently had this hunchback, he had this deformity. Okay? And when Shakespeare was writing, there was an issue. Now, this will definitely be on one of the worksheets. You can look it up online, but I'll do my best to explain it to you now. When a king came to the throne in England, it was due to a concept called the divine right of kings. Okay? The king was almost a messenger from God. The king was put on the throne by God. Okay? That is called the divine right of kings. Monarch was put on the throne by God. Now, obviously, it should be the person who rightfully, legitimately, legally comes to the throne next. And after Edward IV, it would be his oldest son, Edward, and then Edward would have children. So Richard was not ever going to come to the throne legally unless they were all killed somehow. Okay? Now, the other thing about this deformity